Hello, this is Scott Ferguson, Principal Solution Architect in our Global Risk and Security practice. And for the next few minutes, I want to talk to you a little bit about our audit management application. So within ServiceNow, building on maybe some other demos that you've gone through around policy and compliance and risk, we bring all of those together with that third line of defense. That third line of defense is the auditor that's, yeah, I trust you, but I need to verify that you're doing everything that you said you were going to do. So within audit management, the audit application is really focused on managing the engagement of an individual audit. When we look at our audit management dashboard, right, and we're going to see those individual assets that were part of different audit engagements. We're going to see, the different controls that may be part of an engagement. We'll see details around any open issues that have come out as part of one of those audit engagements. And all of this is where someone who's an audit manager, part of that internal audit group, is going to go to kind of see the current status of what all of the engagements are, who's doing what, and the status of where things are at. But operationally, they're probably going to work off of the Audit Workbench. And the Audit Workbench, and you can see here based upon the time frame that we're seeing, is showing us the fact that there are probably multiple audits going on in an environment at the same time. So here at ServiceNow, if I go back to headquarters, you may have Andrew Wheatley, who is our internal director of audit, working on a SOX audit, right? You may have our compliance team working on updating our ISO 27000 certificate. You may have someone in this organization working on a data center cert, or someone working on our, updating our FedRAMP certification. You can have multiple audits all happening at the same time. They have their own resources, they have their own activities, they have their own control tests that are going on. And the reality is that it becomes difficult for many organizations to manage, and you really need a centralized way to manage who's doing what. But more importantly, you also want to be able to reuse evidence that's been gathered. When we look at this workbench, I can see, in this case, there's an IT audit, there's a finance audit, there's a sales and marketing audit, and I can select any one of those on my workbench, and I'm going to see the details behind what's going on with that particular audit engagement. Now, for the sake of our conversation today, as we start to walk through here, I want to go into just one specific audit engagement, and we can kind of look at the entire life cycle. So when I pick up my customer support audit, right, and this is one that's almost to the end. They've gone through an entire life cycle here where you set the scope of an engagement, and in setting the scope of an audit is where you're going to pick what are those assets. Now here's where that asset-centric view of GRC comes into play again, right? In this case, the scope of this audit was, a handful of business services, it was a vendor, but it was also a department. Right? I'm going to audit the customer support department. I'm going to audit the cloudware vendor. I'm going to audit these individual business services as part of this particular engagement. As we advance through the life cycle of that particular engagement, and we moved from scoping into validation and then into field work, the system automatically populated my risk library with all of the risks that related to those in-scope entities. So not that you would evaluate every one of these risks during this audit, but it at least gave that auditor a library of here are all of the things that you could take a look at. It also populated the control library, where for all of those entities that you want to manage as part of this engagement, what are all of the controls that are available? And I can quickly see, in this case, some of them are compliant, some are non-compliant, some have been deemed not applicable. Maybe it was a control that was assigned to that particular application or business service or department, but it wasn't applicable to them because of something in their business, and they've gone through the process of proving out the fact that it was not in scope. But I have my risk library, I have my control library, and from those controls, I have my set of test plans. Now, a test plan is like your audit work paper. And within one of these test plans, and we'll drill into one of these, you're going to see that there's really two different parts to a test plan. There's the design test. And the design test using the 3 lines of defense methodology, the auditor, that third line, is going to look at the second line, the people that own the process, and say, did you design the process properly, right? Did you put all the right steps in place? And what are the procedures that I'm going to use to evaluate that that process is correct? But then that third line, those auditors are going to look at the first line. The first line are those people that are actually doing the work in the field. And from an operational test perspective, they're going to say, are you following the process? Are you doing what you're supposed to do in an ongoing basis to make sure that we're compliant with whatever it is that we happen to be testing against for this particular engagement? And those assessment procedures are typically going to be things like go take a sample of these records, or look at this system, or take a look at that screenshot, evaluate those results, and then deem whether or not it was successful. If we jump back to the engagement, right, as you define the scope, you populate the risk library, you populate the control library, you populate the test plans. From those test plans is how you generate your actual control test. And a control test, in this case, is the actual point-in-time execution. It takes that test plan and makes it an actionable record. It makes it an actual task that's assigned to someone. And if we drill into one of these control tests, you're going to see some of that same data, right? When am I going to test it? And then what was that design test? We see the details here, and they have to deem whether or not it was effective. Operationally, follow these tests. And in this case, both of these were marked effective. But if I was to mark this ineffective, notice it automatically updates the control effectiveness to ineffective. And if I save this as ineffective, and we actually move this to close complete, what we'll see is the control gets marked as non-effective, and it creates an issue for that particular control. And we see that tie back to our policy and compliance application. Now, in this case, there's a couple of things that are going to happen. We also, in audit tasks, not only do we have the control tests, but we also have 3 other task types. You have activities, which can be these one-off, I need someone to go do something, right, or provide something. We're going to have process walkthroughs, where you can assign a task to someone to walk through a process. And then you're also going to have interviews, where you may interview someone in the first line of defense to say, you know, how are you doing this, or how are you complying? All of those are different audit tasks. The last piece of this, from a process perspective, is as you deem one of those control tests as ineffective, is it automatically created my audit finding. And the audit finding is an issue. And we can see here when one of these issues gets created, it too has a life cycle where someone has to analyze, why did we have this breakdown? What were the results of that? We can see that there may be, I may want to generate a new policy exception from this issue, right? Because yes, it was a finding within an audit, but there was a good reason. I can, from that particular issue, generate a policy exception. I may have remediation tasks where someone needs to go take some sort of corrective action to address this, but then I have this control test where I can see the reason this issue was created was because this particular control test was deemed ineffective. So all of this comes together in this issue, and this becomes my audit finding that we have to track through to completion. The other part is not only are there findings, but sometimes you have observations. And in this case, the auditor has the ability to create other issues, not just the audit findings, but these other issues that can be something that was observed through the process that needs to be addressed before you go into your next audit engagement. When it's all said and done, and you get through this entire life cycle, you're going to want to generate an audit report. And by generating the audit report, it's going to take all of those details from what the scope was. It's going to take all the details from every phase of this engagement, and then it's going to document, well, what were the actual findings of this particular audit? What was the description? What's the recommendation? What's the action plan and the explanation that's going to go with that? All of these details are going to be stored in an audit report that can then be delivered to your board or the stakeholders or those individuals that really care about the outcome of this individual audit. And maybe this is how you prove. You take these reports, and this is how you prove that you're ISO 27002 compliant, or yes, you still qualify for your FSMA certification, or yes, you're compliant with all of the SOX controls, and you provide this report to the stakeholders of the bank so that they can file with the SEC. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and publish that. My audit report has now been published, and it's stored in a document that can then be sent off to any of those interested individuals. When it's all said and done, and we work our way through this entire life cycle of an audit, on a day-to-day basis, it comes back to that overview where someone's going to now see where that engagement is in its life cycle, what's the status of those in-scope entities, what's the status of those control tests, what's the status of my open issues and the findings that go with that. And you end up with a score of, from an audit perspective, how many times have I been satisfactory, how many times have I been deemed adequate or even inadequate, in which case I may want to drill into these and get to the bottom of why I may have failed that particular audit engagement. That was a real quick overview of the audit management application, and it's really built upon what we've done in policy and compliance and the risk management application, bringing all of that together into one place so that we can automate, that we can provide visibility into, and really give the organization one spot or one place to look to see how they're doing from a compliance and from a risk perspective, and really proving to those auditors that we're doing what we said we should do. So that wraps up our audit management application. If you have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to check out the website for additional information, and I appreciate your time.